All right, thank you, Max. I'm going to activate this just in a second. There we go. Max also, when he became director of corrections for the state, he tried to get back to me for all my bad revenue forecasts by giving us a tour of the state pen. And we had to sign a release form that whatever happened to us, we were on our own. Luckily, nothing happened. And Ed, I thought, did a wonderful presentation, not boring at all, and it's going to be a tough one to top, I think. Now, Max, by the way, I just want to relate to you. Last time I was introduced to a group, it was a very small group, only about maybe a handful, about 6 people, and it was sort of informal, and I was introduced as Dr. Potiowsky. And one of the people in the group, said to me, "Hey, what line of medicine are you in?" And without thinking, I said, oh, I'm not the kind of doctor that helps people. I'm an economist. The worst part about that is the way they shook their heads knowingly. All right, well, what we'll talk to you a little bit about today is what's going on with the Oregon economy. We've had this very, very slow, almost painfully slow recovery happening in our state, really since around 2009. So this has really been hanging on for quite a long time. But we are in recovery. So that's what I'm going to talk to you today about. Talk a little bit about the U.S., talk a little bit about Oregon. I'm going to end with a little talk about one issue. And in fact, Ed alluded to that issue about the accessibility of higher education. And I think that's actually going to be quite a looming problem going forward. Let's see if this works. No, it doesn't. That works. Now, hey, I was at the state for about 10 years. I came back to Portland State at the university, and they said, "Tom, you're at the university now, so you have to have some slides that are like this." So let's just move on. I did my duty as being at a university, and I've got my Shakespeare slide. All right, let's move. All right, what I want to talk about here. Now you got to show that you got this highbrowness now. You have to be what do we call it in university language? We say it's much better to be profound than to be prepared. All right, quarterly GDP. That's our broadest economic measure that we have in the U.S. And the one theme I'm going to come around to, because this is a very slow expansion, and then also this may be somewhat of the norm going forward. We're going to have more business cycles, but coming out of these, we may experience slow recoveries from now on for at least a couple of decades. And so what I want you to take a look, just broadly looking at this graph, all these lines are here, and as economists, we love graphs. You can see that the heights of these lines are less than they were before, and it's kind of diminishing. The expansions are a little longer than they were before, but the expansion periods aren't as robust as they were before. And this is exactly what we're seeing this time around. Now, I've got to show I'm an economist, so I've got to have at least one graph no one can understand. Here's my graph. Now, what this graph is really looking at different financial crises that have happened across time, really post-World War II. And notice down below here, those are years of time. So if you come up to the top of the graph where they all start at 0%, that's the start of a financial crisis. And then jobs were lost. And then there's recovery, and jobs come back. When you reach that 0% horizontal line again, you're back to the same level of jobs that happened before the financial crisis. And take a look down below, how many years it's taken some of these countries just to get back to the same level of employment. These aren't months down here, these are years that it takes. And in retrospect, the dark red line is the US. We're not doing too bad relative to what other countries have experienced through this time. But we're playing out the script. When you have a financial crisis, Financial markets are the communication link to all other economic markets. When that communication link breaks down, it affects all markets, not just the financial market. And so it's taking some time for repair to happen, and it's going to take some time for us to do a recovery. Now, some risks and spillover effects, and I think these are also true for Oregon. I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but these are risks that you've seen in the news over and over again. I'm going to concentrate on a couple of these as we go on. I'll talk a little bit more about the housing situation, which I think we're finally, at least a lot of signs are there, that we've reached bottom. It took a while since basically end of 2006, 2007 to get to the bottom, but I really think we've actually reached that point. But I think the two main risks for the U.S. and also which spill over to Oregon is the European sovereign debt issues and also the Chinese issue. And any of the other economies, especially in the Pacific Rim, where Oregon has a predominance of where we export to, is our issues that are on the horizon. But for the most part, we're not looking at another recession, I don't think, anytime soon. The risk is actually there, but we are making our way through a rather difficult time. But I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to go through all these issues. We also have some positive issues that may be occurring. The housing market is still somewhat of unknown. There's lots of bad stuff on banks' balance sheets, and we don't know how quickly they're going to happen. For example, Oregon just had a law that was instituted that says that people in foreclosure have to have mediation, and there's a lot more reporting that has to do. Well, what this does immediately is slow down foreclosures. So you look at the data and you go, hey, things look better, foreclosures are less. But it could just be a temporary pause because of the new law. So we'll have to see how that goes through. So anyways, there's risks out there. I want to go over to Oregon. I've got 20 minutes. I'm going to get through these. Some recent Oregon facts. We're 8.5% unemployment rate for June. The July figures for Oregon come out next week. I think probably about 8.5. It's either going to be 8.4 or 8.6. It's just in that area where we're sort of flat right now, moving through. 32nd fastest job growth. That's our nice way of saying we have the 19th slowest job growth of any state. Okay, non-farm employment, very weak. We should be seeing this kind of growth at least in the 2% range at this point in a recovery, and we're seeing these soft patches. We had one in 2010. We've got another one coming into this year in 2012. But take a look at the math here. Total non-farm employment was up 43,200. The private sector employment was up 51,400. So how much was the government employment sector up by? Negative 8,200. And that's one of the issues I'm going to bring up as to why this recovery is being a bit slow. Personal income growth, still a bit slow. It should be a lot stronger than that at this time, but still it's in the positive range. In Oregon exports, we're feeling finally this little bit of slowdown in the European situation and also in China. And we're finding our exports are being a little soft. Now, they basically have gone up to pre-recession levels, but the slowness that's happening is starting to affect our manufacturing sector. Now, it's interestingly, I don't have graphs on this, but it's almost as if the manufacturing sector is starting to slow down a little bit, just as the housing sector seems to be slightly coming back. Still very, very weak and down quite a bit. But the hope is that we'll be able to make it through this period of time, because possibly I think the housing sector will finally, after basically since 2007 early, may start to be adding some positive numbers to the economic outlook. But not at a rapid rate, but at a slow rate. Still, it hadn't been doing it before. You learned that one graph, so you can learn this graph pretty easily. All right, same idea. These are with Oregon with employment. And in the U.S., we've called this past recession the Great Recession. You know, they called it that because no, of course, politician would ever say that we were in the Depression period. So we call it the Great Recession. Last time that happened, by the way, was under the Carter administration. Alfred Kahn, a very famous economist, was in the Carter administration at the time, and he came out in late 1979 and told the press, I think the U.S. is headed for a depression. Carter administration called him in, said, Alfred, don't talk like that. Have a press conference, tell him you didn't mean that at all, not under our administration. Alfred went out to the press the next day, said, I misspoke, I meant to say that we were headed for the big banana. And he was fired that afternoon. So we will never have another depression. But our Great Recession for Oregon, for those of you that are old enough, was the early 1980s. That's that light blue line. That's the period that really hit us even harder than this one. And we made it through. That's the theme. We do get through these. This is only at March, a little old, but I wanted to give some aspect of some unemployment rates that are around the region. The Portland metro area has really been one of the regions that have increased jobs the most, and they've sort of benefited the most out of this recovery so far. We haven't had much of the other regions in the state really joining in. Although I've talked to people around the Bend area, up at the coast. I was in Pendleton a couple of weeks ago. There seems to be some, at least, positive signs that we're seeing across the state. But if you just look at the numbers, it really is just in terms of the Portland metro area. This graph is, just very quickly, it's showing Portland and it's showing Seattle. And then the other two lines show the rest of Oregon minus Portland, and the rest of Washington minus Seattle. And what you can see is that Portland and Seattle follow each other pretty well. They've dropped down into the recession and they started to come out together. The rural, supposedly, area, we'll just call it non-Seattle for Washington, seem to not have dropped as far and is starting to come out a little bit. As opposed to the Oregon section, that's non-Portland, is down and has stayed down. Now, as Max would know, a legislature would just salivate at this kind of graph because they would say, hey, what is Washington doing right and what is Oregon doing wrong? And it's all those Oregon policies that we all hate anyways. So, how do you, yeah, here. So how do you explain this? Well, it turns out that there's like 3 reasons that kind of explain this a little bit. And one of them is the federal stimulus money. It turns out radiation's a good thing. You know, if you got to clean up Hanford and so on, and you throw a couple $1 billion in a small rural area, they can do okay. That's one of the reasons. The other is that although the wood products industry is important in Washington, it doesn't have the same aspect of importance as it does here in Oregon. And given the housing crisis and so on, we were proportionally hit harder in our rural areas than Washington was. And then third, Washington really didn't have a sort of metro area outside of Seattle that had the same housing crisis that our metro areas did outside of Portland. If you just take a look at Bend, you take a look at Medford, Washington really didn't experience those kind of drops. And that pretty much can explain just about all of the differences. All right, housing and government are drags on our recovery. Why we're having this slow recovery. Lots of lines here, and you can, if you can see towards the right, you got Oregon and Washington here. Maybe if I can get the mouse to work. Here we go. Seattle and Oregon. But the good things to notice, these are the drops from the from December, from the peak years that happened early in 2007. But notice that across the board, the drops are not as great. That means that the prices are starting to go up a little bit. So that's good news across the country and also in terms of Seattle and Portland. But they still are quite depressed. And that affects people's spending patterns and everything else. So we shouldn't expect a lot of help from the housing industry anytime soon. These are price indexes. You can see Bend, the huge run-up. When you have a huge run-up, you have a huge correction. When you have all these construction people and everything going into Bend, and then there's no construction jobs, they have to go somewhere, and they start to leave the area. But look at this. And the latest data from this federal agency is the first quarter, they actually had a price increase for the first time. Of course, you know, we're talking about if a home was $700,000, now it's $350,000, now it's $356,000. You know, not much of a change, but at least the bottom, I think, is being reached, which is a good sign. And notice that's across the board of these metro areas in Oregon. Now, housing starts. When a lot of times when someone shows you a graph of two lines, they want to say, well, I just want to show you the trend. So if I look at the left, the blue graph is with the left side, and the red graph is the numbers on the right side, but I just want to show the trend. But if you look, they're the same numbers. I don't have to tell you what's left or right. And we're looking at a 27-year difference in time. Wow. So here are the housing starts starting, the red is from 1978 through 1991, and you can see the drop. And these are the same housing starts starting in 2005 through a forecast of 2018. And what has happened to population in Oregon over the 27-year period? You know, it's gone, it's almost doubled. And you're having the same level of housing starts. This is how bad this housing crisis was. And likewise, the expectation is that you don't come bouncing out of this thing. It's going to take a slow rise coming out also. All right, just very quickly, although this is March, a little bit late, all I want to show you is that state level where we have government jobs are down. You can go to the Portland area, find the same thing, basically flat in the Bend area. But that's pretty much the story throughout the state. Because of the slow recovery, the amount of revenues coming into state and local governments have been very, very slow. On top of it, because of the slow recovery, their demand of their services has not come down very much. And so you have this budget problem that they're trying to fix. And consequently, governments, they hire people, teachers and so on, go to grocery stores, they go to dry cleaners, they spend their money in the community like everybody else does. And if we lose that kind of spending, it does slow down your economic growth. So housing is not contributing to the growth. State and local governments have been detracting from the growth. All right, now some short-run forecasting. This comes from my old office, the Office of Economic Analysis. Notice that same trend I showed you with GDP. These are slower expansions that we're looking at. These are some of the industry winners that we're seeing. Now, by winners, let me give you an analogy. I had a bet with my brother-in-law to lose weight. And so at the end of the period of time, we went for 10 weeks. I won the bet. I gained 7 pounds and he gained 10. And so that's how this is sort of with these job growths here. I mean, they've all lost jobs, but these are at least starting to stabilize and bringing some jobs back. But they still are not back to where they were before the recession hit. All right, and you can see this. You can see it in government. Once again, they're very latecomers generally to recessions, so they've had this sort of downtrend in through here. Notice that this also includes higher ed. And if I took higher ed out of these numbers, this graph would really be down much further. Because opportunity costs drops during recessions, enrollment really starts to go up quite high at the four-year institutions. All right, now some of the losers. Now, I have manufacturing in here, but they actually are one of the ones that have kind of come back a little bit better, this purple line right here. But construction, of course, is down quite dramatically. And it's probably going to be some time before it comes back up. What I did here is, this is population change. I took your 9 regions that you have for the Oregon Community Foundation, and I put some numbers to those regions that you have. And so these are population changes that are expected to happen to 2030. This comes from a forecasting service, very nicely, the Office of Economic Analysis. Let me borrow this. I really question this a little bit. The Central Oregon at 30%, especially. I think they rely too much on historical data, and I think it's a little bit of a new ball game in Central Oregon. I think you'll still see population growth there higher than relative to, say, Eastern Oregon, but I don't know if it's going to be higher than the Portland metro area. But all these rates, this is a 20-year period, these are much slower population growth than we saw through the 1990s and even 2000s. And that's one of the reasons for a slower expansion. All right, take a look at the non-farm employment. Portland metro area, of course, has quite a bit. And we come down here to these other areas of your 9 sectors. And then a forecast of those areas. Once again, I think that this forecasting service, Global Insight, was a little too optimistic in the Central Oregon area. But pretty much, this is, I think, what you'll probably see across the board. The Portland metro area probably still is going to see the largest increases that are going to occur. Slower expansions going forward. One of the reasons, this is for the US. Look at this labor force participation rate. How many people are in what we call the workforce? That means people that are employed and people that are looking for work, compared to the population that could be drawn from, 16 years old and over, the civilian labor force. And it's had quite a drop starting in the 2000s, and it's come down quite a bit. And so if you're having the participation in the labor force is less, you should also expect less growth too, because that goes right along with the population. Now, working age cohort declining. This is for Oregon. And notice this is the base here of this age group is actually falling in terms of percentage of the total population. Now, what are the consequences of that? Well, we know some of the problems in terms of nationally, Social Security problems. This is where we get the people paying into Social Security, and that base is starting to shrink a little bit. That's not good, especially for Bax and I. We don't want to see that. But I have confidence in our U.S. Congress. And the confidence I have is they are going to change Social Security eligibility and so on, so that Max and I will be forced to be working into our 80s. So we won't have this shortage that's going to occur. Actually, speaking of the 80s, you know, my father was just about turning 80 years old, and he said, I think this is already happening, where people are returning to the workforce for longer, and we're having older age workers. He went into a fast food place, and he said the guy that had the headphones on and so on looked like he was about 80 years old, as he was. And so he drove up, and the guy with the headphones on said, welcome to so-and-so, can I take your order? And my dad said, what? And the guy in the window said, what? My dad said, what? So it's not going to be pretty. But we will have to deal with it. You know, just at a sort of a serious note, you know, really, those of you that are out in business, you are going to have to figure out how to work with an older workforce. I mean, and what are their needs, and part-time work, and working for, I mean, there's going to be some real issues coming up, because believe it or not, we are going to be in stronger recovery, and we are eventually going to hit a labor shortage. All right, to sum up, I think we will follow the U.S. economy, very slow expansions, slow growth because of the financial crisis, population participation. Manufacturing has helped out, but it's slowing it down a little bit. We haven't had the traditional boost from housing, but slowly but surely it's starting to come back in to help us out. So I think job growth is going to be pretty subdued throughout this time. Now, one present and future looming issue that I want to address, and Ed really talked about it, and this is the issue of higher ed accessibility. And what I want to mention in this is that, you know, this is where hopefully we have people that can have a strong economic life going forward. We've seen the data. The difference right now between the wages and incomes between having a college education and having a high school have diverged even greater than they did before. And this is, I think, just a real problem. Take a look at this one, consumer debt. Now, of course, the biggest item in consumer debt for households is mortgages. And we know that this going down here is a good sign because we're starting to get that mortgage back into balance. And of course, unfortunately, it didn't go down because people were paying off their mortgages early, right? It was going down because people were losing their mortgages. They were going under. But look at this one, the red, right? This is what, about 8%. Student loan as a percent of total consumer debt is now larger than credit card debt. Almost larger than any of those other items, except, of course, for mortgage. All right. Annual percentage change in state appropriations. This is national, but Oregon fits right into this picture. Has definitely gone down. They always do tend to go down during recessions. And tuition and fees have generally been going up and higher than inflation. And when you have an institution that can have the fees that can be charged, it tends to be somewhat of an easy target for budget cutting because they are able to somehow try to make it up through their fee increases. This was just in today's Wall Street Journal, which I was planning on talking about this anyways. It was great that the article came out. Not great in what it had to say, was that the proportion of debt held by families has risen the fastest for even larger, higher income groups, into the $100,000 range for family incomes. The largest increase they've seen for the past 3 years ever in the history that they've kept the data. So, and at the same time, what are people's outlooks of how they're going to financially do? This comes from the University of Michigan Survey of Consumers, and this is their expectation of how they think their income is going to increase. And notice that it hits right at 2008, at the end of 2008, and basically goes down to 0%. That's their outlook. So you got families that don't think their income's going to go up. They're worried about their wealth position and being able to finance their kids through school. They're not sure they can handle and shoulder all that debt. Education attainment around the state for your 9 regions. And of course, in the Portland metro area has the highest, and that mainly is because we imported people, not that we've necessarily educated more Oregonians in higher ed. And then to add to this, the desire is there to do something. This is Ed also mentioned the 40-40-20 goal that we have for 2025, I believe it is. But, how are we going to reach this goal if the ability to financially shoulder the cost of college is there? And at the same time, the returns are still there too. But it's just the ability to be able to finally get into the college and afford to come there. Okay, that's kind of a depressing note. Sorry about that. So, hey, what about the future? So what I did is I went to OPB, and in 2009 they had the 150-year anniversary, and they said, hey, Oregonians, what do you think is going to happen in the next 150 years? And I figured the listeners to OPB are probably smarter than I am. So here's some of their comments of what they think is going to be the future. Oregon would be part of the new nation of Cascade. Of course, this one always comes up, right? Every year, everyone thinks we're going to be this. But the part about it that will mainly be agricultural is kind of interesting. Becomes a new automobile manufacturing capital, leads the nation. So this is a person that probably very much believes in electrical vehicles, or they're probably in an anti-sales tax camp. Alternative fuels from algae will grow well in our climate and become an export. And if we throw in slugs, we'll be there. Oregon modernized. Look at this. Transportation system. People and cargo can board their vehicles directly onto speeding train. That never slows down. Now there's some technology for you. Don't even have to slow the train down. Okay, we will think about digging a canal from Longview to Puget Sound. Now this prompted another person to comment on this. And then, actually, this last one is for all of you here. And on a serious note, no, the most insightful piece that this person took away from the broadcast was, the future is not something we will land on, but rather what we construct it to be. And I think that's so apropos for your group and the great work that you do. So here's some background information. My old staff put this up because I am a whitewater kayaker, and they thought it was good that I was in this. As we go through the legislative sessions, we definitely went without our helmets on. But some contact information. Max was very nice to say that I have some brochures in the back office about my brand new research center, which we're very excited about. And I don't know if there's time for questions, Max? Or... Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Quick one. If you look at the GDP and you correct it for inflation, what does it look like?
Those numbers I showed you were corrected for inflation. Yes. And that's you should always look at it in terms of that.